Hello, everyone. Before I start, I would like to voice my thanks to the organizers of this event.
Worldviews, Latin American art in the Decolonial
Thank you
term,
to
Michael Asbury,
Michael Asbury, Sofia
Gatti,
Gotti
por
for having
organizar
organized
essa
the conference
conferência e
Worldviews Latin American
também,
Art
especialmente
and
a
the
Sofia,
Decolonial Turn.
que é organizadora dessa sessão. Eu vou imediatamente começar a
I
ler
will
essa minha
read
comunicação
a
que se
text.
intitula Pequena História da
The
Arte,
text is
Paradoxos da Arte
entitled
Indígena como Origem Canônica da
A
Arte
Short Art
Latino-Americana,
History, Paradox
especialmente
in Indigenous
vou
Art
tratar do caso
as the canon origin
brasileiro
of Latin
em
American
alguns
art. I'll be
aspectos
talking about the Brazilian
reflexivos
case.
para pensarmos o campo da
I hope
arte
these reflections help you
latino-americana
understand
mais
Latin
geral.
American art as a whole.
No início dessa minha interpretação acerca
As
da
I
gênese
started
da
to
noção
interpret
de
the
arte
genesis of the
indígena,
notion of
estava numa
indigenous art,
publicação editada pelo
I
Comitê
looked into a
Brasileiro
publication
na
edited by the Brazilian
ocasião
Committee on the
de
occasion of the
Paris
Universal
em
Exposition in
1889,
Paris
onde
in
houve
1889.
a construção de pavilhão
A
brasileiro
Brazilian
ali,
pavilion was
entre as
built.
várias outras exposições montadas na ocasião.
Brazil participated in
Essa
this event.
exposição, Le Brésil em 1889, foi uma publicação
This
editada em
publication
25 capítulos,
accounted for
com um
25
capítulo
chapters,
dedicado
and one
à
of which
arte, pelo
was
qual
dedicated to art.
eu
And this
vou me
is what I'll
dedicar.
be focusing on.
Essa publicação ocorre, então, dentro desses esforços, né, de apresentar o Brasil na Exposição Universal Digital,
Brazil was presented
entre os quais a
in this
realização
Paris
de uma
exhibit,
exposição dentro de uma
and there was
outra
an exhibit
exposição
within
dedicada à
another
educação humana, uma
exhibit
exposição que contou com
dedicated to the
32
history of human
edificações construídas
habitats.
abaixo da Torre Eiffel, entre as quais uma edificação dedicada à habitação,
There
à
was one
história da
specific
habitação
building focused
Inca
on the Inca
peruana, na qual o Brasil
population.
então participa, né, com uma sala instalada nessa casa, né, nas
Brazil had a
quais
room inside
a
this
exposição
building.
de artefatos e objetos
In this room,
arqueológicos e etnográficos
archaeological and
brasileiros. Essa exposição
ethnographic
foi organizada
objects
pelo Ladislau Neto,
were exhibited.
então
This was
diretor do
organized by
Museu
Ladislao Neto,
Nacional do Rio
director
de
of the
Janeiro.
National Museum
Essa
of Rio de
exposição
Janeiro.
apresentava, segundo um cronista de época, eu cito,
This
uma
exhibit, and
reconstrução
here I quote,
conscienciosa e
was a
erudita de
conscientious
documentos, os
reconstruction
mais raros, os mais
of the
sérios,
rarest and
um
most
pequeno museu
serious documents, a small
antropológico,
museum of American antiques.
trajes completos de
There were
posturas
complete
e
costumes of
acessórios,
botocudos and
eram
chivaros
apresentados
that are not
juntos
very
a
impressive.
objetos de arte plumária e
There were
artefatos
also
arqueológicos
prehistoric vases,
recém-restaurados no contexto da
which were
arqueologia
part of the
recente.
Brazilian
A
archaeology history.
publicação em questão,
This was a chronicler of the times
conceito,
quote.
né, trazia então
The
esse
publication I
capítulo
mentioned had a
dedicado à
chapter
arte no Brasil,
dedicated to
pedido
art.
pelo intelectual paulista Eduardo
It was
Prado,
written by
que
Eduardo Prado,
eu gostaria de frisar aqui, né, me parece inaugurar um
and
capítulo
this
original
chapter
da
inaugurates
recém-constituída história da arte no
a
Brasil,
newly
e
constituted
que
history of Brazilian art,
colocava ao mesmo tempo
placing
em
it
uma
at the beginning
discussão
of this
narrativa
narrative
sobre a
about
arte nacional
the national art
a
production,
produção das populações
including
indígenas
indigenous
como
populations.
esteio e modelo para o
They
desenvolvimento
were seen as the
urgente
mainstay and
integrado
model
da
for the
arte
development of what he
representativa
considered
das
to be
artes
urgent,
nacionais.
the national industrial
As ideias
arts.
do texto de
The
Eduardo
ideas in
Prado são
Eduardo Prado's
derivadas de
text
publicações que haviam sido
come from
recentemente no
publications
Brasil
that had been
como
recently published in
Belas Artes,
Brazil,
Estudos e
Belas
Apreciações,
Artes
de
e
Félix Ferreira,
Apreciações by
publicado
Felix
em
Ferreira, published in
1885, e
1885, and
todo o
all of the
debate
artistic debate
artístico que
that
se intensificava a partir dos
intensified
anos de
from the
1870, né,
1870s
incluindo a
onwards,
discussão
especially
da noção
around the
de
notion
arte
of
e de
art
escola no
and a
Brasil.
Brazilian school.
Além de se situar nesse debate, né,
In
o
addition to
texto de
that,
Prado traz de maneira bastante
Prado's text
original
is
também
quite
o nome da
original.
fonte
It collects different sources about the
artística no
artistic
Brasil,
production in
de
Brazil,
viajantes até compêndio, vamos dizer assim, de
especially
manuscritos que
from
apontavam o que
travelers'
tinha a
reports
respeito da arte
and
produzida no
collections of
território
texts
brasileiro.
of what had been done in the Brazilian art
Como
context.
o aspecto em grande medida original, né, tendo como precedentes, até onde a gente pode averiguar, os textos do
Texts
Charles
by
Hart e do
Charles
Félix
Hart
Ferreira,
and
né,
Felix
de
Ferreiras
analisar a arte
on
indígena
the
no Brasil,
indigenous art in
publicados
Brazil
na revista
were
de
both published in the
Socioantropologia de
magazine or the
1882,
Journal
nos
of
registraram
Anthropological Exhibition of
claros e
1882.
apanhado, né, do
In
patrimônio
Prado's text,
artístico brasileiro, e não só das artes visuais,
visual
né,
arts
com
are seen as
proximidade
part
a
of the
elas,
Brazilian artistic heritage.
especialmente aquilo que se então entendia como
What
belas
was seen
artes,
as
né, de
the
fato
Beaux-Arts, the Bellas
mas,
Artes,
no meu entender, isso se dá porque a
was
noção
seen according to a very particular
que
notion of
partia,
art
né, com relação
the
à arte
author
não era
had.
abrangente, né,
This concept was way
envolve,
more
abrange,
comprehensive. It
abarca
encompassed
monumentos
architectural
históricos,
monuments,
paisagismo,
landscaping,
manifestações
manifestations of
da
indigenous
ornamental,
ornamental art,
utilitária,
especially feathers,
decorativa, a
utilitarian
cultura
art,
oral,
decorative
popular,
art, popular oral
da
culture,
música
songs,
dita
both
e
classical and
popular
popular,
de matriz
that
ibérica e de
had
matriz indígena.
Iberian and
Por
indigenous
outro lado,
matrices.
a valorização que Prado faz da produção
The
colonial
appreciation
de
of the
fato,
colonial production
ele
is remarkable,
realiza grande esforço de resenhar, né, tudo aquilo
and
que
he
já tinha
tries
sido
to
escrito
summarize everything
até
that
então
had been
a
written
respeito desse
before up
período
until
histórico.
then.
Mas o que me interessa aqui destacar com vocês hoje é, de
I
fato, a
wanted to emphasize
originalidade
how original
do
this
lado do que
report
diz
is
respeito à
with regards
popularidade
to
da produção
the
colonial.
way indigenous production is seen.
Nele, nesse relato, aparece
This
sintetizada uma
report
opinião que veio surgir
summarizes an
entre os
opinion
intelectuais e críticos nas
that
duas décadas precedentes,
was
onde para
created
o público
amongst
brasileiro,
intellectuals and critics over the previous 2 decades. The
americano,
idea that
devia
the
ser
indigenous
considerado
material
como arte,
cultures should be
como
considered
um
art,
elemento-chave e originário
being
de uma ideia de
key
arte
and an
nacional.
original element of this idea
O
of
seu exame
an original
parece
national
se
art.
centra exatamente
Prado
nas
focuses
manifestações
on
das artes
examining the
veladas e
manifestations
das
of feather
rituais.
art and basketry.
Ainda que ele contraste essas
He compares this
manifestações, né,
with the
das
fine
belas
arts.
artes, considerando-as a arte rudimentar que se havia encontrado entre os indígenas no Brasil, ele
He compares
dedica
that to what he considers to be
ênfase a uma
rudimentary art
percepção
that had been found
dessa produção,
amongst the indigenous people in
sublinhando
Brazil.
então recentes
He
descobertas em
discovers
produtos cerâmicos da Amazônia,
products in the
considerados de
Amazon
particular
region,
ornamentação
ceramics
e de
considered to be of
linguística
particular
popular que
ornamentation,
permitem certo desenvolvimento
and that
excelente na beleza das formas.
that was
Ele considera
outstanding
a arte da
in the beauty
ornamentação
of the
plural
forms.
aquela que
Prado
mais
considers the
havia
art
se
of feather ornaments
destacado,
as
impressionado os
something that
colonizadores. Ressalta
probably
o
stood
fato
out the
dessas
most
tradições se
when the
manterem
first
vivas,
invaders
se
came
manterem
to these
entre
lands. And
povos
he highlights the fact
capazes
that
de
these traditions
tolerar
remain
entre
amongst different
mais belas
peoples
oposições e
that
gradações de
can
cor, com o
make
brilhante
the
de
best
cor do fogo,
adaptations
do
of beautiful
cheiro, do
oppositions of
amarelo de
colors
rúcula,
with
do
the red of
narciso
fire
e
in
do azul
flames,
da
the yellow
cidreira.
of a rich shade
Ele
of
lembra
narcissus, and the most beautiful blue. He
espécies aqui
remembers these
produzidas, né,
specimens produced or
no livro que eu
reproduced in the
citei,
Brid's
mas também
book,
naquelas
as well
litografias
as the lithographs
coloridas
produced
realizadas
from the
por
works
trabalho
of the
dos
Geographical and
cientistas
Geological
brasileiros
Commission of the
nesse
Empire in
período.
the Ceará
Isso que a
expedition.
gente vê aqui
That's
é
what we see
gravado
on the slide.
pelo Instituto Artístico dos Irmãos Flores. Depois de comentar
After commenting
o
on
lado
the feather ornaments and other ornaments,
frustradas tentativas de encontrar grandes
despite being
monumentos construídos por
frustrated
indígenas no
due to
território
his
brasileiro,
attempts to
digamos, a
find
obsessão,
large
né,
monuments
da
built by
colonização,
indigenous peoples in
o
Brazilian
autor
territory, the
retoma as
author
artes cerâmicas
returns to the
produzidas em
ceramic arts
território
produced
indígena.
by indigenous
E
peoples.
tratando,
To do
ele
so,
recorre justamente aos
he
escritos
resorts
daqueles
to the
primeiros
writings of the
portugueses
first
ao
scholar
reclamar o
that
valor
claimed the
artístico
artistic
dos
value of
contemporâneos
indigenous
indígenas
material
do tempo
productions in
brasileiro.
Brazilian territory.
Eram
The
geólogos,
Canadian
antropólogos,
geologist,
botânicos e
paleontologist,
linguistas
and
da época.
naturalist Charles Frederick Hart. In his essay, Origin of Art or Evolution of Ornament, written after his research trips to Brazil in 1867 and 1871, Hart maintained that there was a need to consider the ornaments present in indigenous objects as art. Prado comments on the findings of Hart and analyzes the differences between the production of raw and cooked Amazonian ceramics. He describes the characteristics of some funerary urns and focuses on describing the archaeological findings of Hart and his team in the island of Marajó, in the mountains of Pacoval, sustaining that they had changed the perceptions about the indigenous industry, and according to him, the utilitarian production and expressing imagination and artistic thought. The vases and plates found in his archaeological studies, well, after that, he observes and analyzes the observance of rules, but he also sees a concern with the human figure, which he considers at the same time the highest and the first expression of art. As far as he understands, these works show beautiful proportions, they all reveal a concern for beauty, and the artist didn't look for the simple convention only. He also looked for the engraved decorations or painted decorations. This would have a definite sense and originality in forms, in the ornaments that finds no resemblance in any other example of ceramic art from ancient peoples. Prado's writing corroborates an expressive change regarding the appreciation of indigenous arts produced by native peoples in the Brazilian territory. At the same time, he builds the conditions for the discursive operation that would consider this production the origin of a national art. Indeed, in later narratives, the presence of indigenous art in manuals, panoramic books, and collections would become frequent, almost like a topos of an idea of national art, from Teodoro Braga, Vicente Dorrego Monteiro, Tarsila do Amaral, Mario de Andrade to Mario Pedrosa. We can observe the persistence of a narrative model that takes indigenous art and considers that, at the same time, the origin and the result of Brazilian art, a repository that at the same time signals to its originality an infinite source of renewal. It's also important to note that this hegemony contrasts with the almost absolute absence of the same production in Brazilian art museums, as well as the voice of their authors. Even in academic production on the history of art in Brazil, which is the case we're now analyzing, there is little about indigenous artistic production. At the same time, its omnipresence became natural. Its invisibility also became natural as a field of knowledge that has its own history, agents, and its own forms of organization. This history of art is brief, as put by Denilson Brenny. The concrete absence of indigenous art in art collections from the 19th century until now has not resulted in any expressive change to these narrative models of Brazilian art. Despite still making use of this mythical structure of a narrative of origin situated in indigenous art and something that is frequently resorted to, either to look for sources of originality, supposedly autochthonous elements of the national culture, or even to outline critical positions in solidarity with issues such as land demarcation, the environmental crisis, or racism. What would be the importance of debating this discursive and symbolic operation nowadays, when the concerns of art historians, researchers, and curators turn to the need to create counter-colonial narratives of the arts?
mas ainda
When
que haja
indigenous
esforços
voices from
imensos de
artists to
curadores,
curators,
artistas,
researchers to
pesquisadores,
producers
escritores,
demand a
demandam um
historical
impacto
reparation,
na história,
a
uma
resumption of the
retomada do
spaces of
espaço
history
da história, do
in
museu,
museums
do patrimônio, aos quais lhe foi negado
and
acesso como
heritage
sujeitos,
that were
e que
denied
hoje
entry as
estavam em
subjects,
reta disputa
occupying them as
repertório,
objects of study,
tema e inspiração.
theme,
A
repertoire,
importância
and
dramática
inspiration, as
desses
if they were
recursos sobre
nature available
artistas,
to artists,
pesquisadores,
researchers, and
líderes
creators of
contemporâneos,
identities,
fazem
allegedly
perceptível da
constituting
brasilidade,
what means to be
nacionalidade,
Brazilian.
americanidade.
How does the
Como a
discipline
cultura
of art
ocidental
history
responde
respond
para
to the
entender
prominence of indigenous
as indigenous
artists and
voices?
researchers today? How is
Como
it
ser
able in this
parte desse
process to
processo e
reassess
reavaliar
its
seus
criteria,
critérios e
periods, and
referências,
methods?
métodos?
Above all, how
Sobretudo,
can
como
it
pode se
allow
deixar de
itself to be
viver esse
reviewed
espaço
and
pelos
rethought by
próprios
the indigenous
internos
peoples themselves
e tornar-se
and
assim
become
um
an ally
lugar
in the
circulatório do
circulation and
conhecimento,
valorization or
da vida,
appreciation of their
na
knowledge,
defesa de
in
seus
the
valores
defense
de
of their
vida,
ways of
da sua
life,
patrimônio
of their
cultural,
intangible heritage, inseparable
inseparável
from the
da sua
material and
arte
artistic culture
cultural?
they produce? The
O
recognition of
reconhecimento
artistic productions
estabelecido pelas
made
críticas a partir do
from the
material para
perspective of
aqueles
the
indivíduos
individuals who
que os
traced
consomem,
them, as
como
mentioned by
julgamos
Terena,
deles, é
well,
algo
this is
que
something that
não
should
deve
be
ser
done
não só
not only by the demand of
teóricos
those
que
who
já
requested or
participaram ou dela se
took
apropriaram.
advantage of them. These
Essas
voices
relações
were
foram
not heard.
mudadas. Como
How will
falar
art
do
history
emocional
relate
das
to the
formas
immaterial
materiais
forms that
que
permeate these
impregna
productions and
seus sonhos e
constitute their
cultos
own poetic
e seus próprios
foundations?
fundamentos poéticos,
Ceremonial
códigos de
codes,
identidade,
memories,
memórias,
enchantments,
comportamentos,
visions, and
visões,
dreams.
sonhos. Atravessada por um
A
espaço
history of
anacrônico,
erasure.
essa visibilidade
This
exige
visibility
tratar
today,
do
demanded and
potencial dos
managed by
artistas
indigenous
e
artists and
pesquisadores
researchers,
indígenas
coincides with
confunde
the political
com
and
os
resistance
políticos
field. Indigenous art
hoje é
today
aquilo que sujeitos indígenas demandam por
is
tratar a
about
partir da sua própria
the
voz.
indigenous voices. In a
No primeiro
first
momento da
version of
fala,
this
que
speech,
recentemente publiquei em
recently
revista
published
Nós,
in Modo's
terminava minha
journal, I
fala
ended my
afirmando a
words
urgência de escuta
reaffirming the urgency of
atenta
listening to the
dos
demands of
artistas
indigenous artists
indígenas.
today.
Eu citava
And I
o
want to
poema
quote the
Reantropofagia,
poem
do Deus Romano, mais
Reanthropophagia,
uma vez, que de certa maneira faz uma
which
reivindicação de
is a
reparação
demand, maybe a
sarcástica e
sarcastic demand for reparation. That's
dura,
a harsh
como,
demand.
como é a fala do artista. Com toda a sua mordacidade, entretanto, ele traz uma
However, there
promessa
was a
de
promise and hope.
dessa reparação.
Hope for reparation.
Hoje, entretanto, eu encerro essa
To
fala em
conclude,
choque e em dor.
I am in shock
E
and I
gostaria de
grieve.
compartilhar com vocês, mais uma vez,
And I
o
want to
que o
share
poeta
with you
artista
another excerpt
gentilmente me
from the artist who allowed
emprestou.
me to share this with you.
Uma carta do
This is
Nilson
a
Baniwa
letter
a todos
from
nós.
Denilson Baniwa to all of us.
Olá,
Hello,
espero que
I
esteja
hope you're
firme e
doing
vivo nesses
well
tempos difíceis que
despite these
passamos.
difficult times we've been through.
Como deve
As you
saber,
may know,
essa semana fomos
this week we were
surpreendidos por um
surprised by
encontro
Jider
inesperado
Isbell
nesse mundo.
enchantment.
Desde
Since
que eu e
he and
ele
I
nos encontramos
met each
nesse
other in
mundo,
this world, we've
vivemos
lived and built
justamente dois
together
caminhos que
our
talvez foram
paths that I
importantes
think were
para essa
important for the
nossa
scene we
história.
can see today.
Nos
We
amamos,
loved
nos
each other,
odiamos,
we fought, we
discutimos,
discussed, we
brincamos,
played, we
e
traveled
às vezes,
together through
por
the heat
favores
and
que vêm
cold.
comum,
We
também
laughed, we
choramos,
cried.
bagunçamos o coreto, como dizem por aí, ficamos sem nos
We
falar,
stopped
voltamos a nos
speaking to each
falar,
other. We
trabalhamos,
started speaking
tomamos
with each other
muitas
again. We
decisões
worked
e
together.
lidamos com muita coisa,
We crossed
discordamos
seas
de
and
muitas
rivers.
coisas,
We agreed,
mas em
we
uma coisa
disagreed,
éramos
but
incorruptíveis.
one thing we had in common. We wanted to
Desejamos
build
de construir
art
uma arte onde pessoas indígenas
where
pudessem
indigenous
ter
people
voz
could
ativa,
have active voices and could have a
chance
chance to
de quem
perhaps
sabe
reach the
chegar um
top,
pouco,
a
pois
place we've
éramos
never
muito
been before.
extravagentes.
Jider
Já
got to
desejamos
this place
chegar o que para os brancos é considerado
for what
sucesso.
white people consider to be
Para
success.
nós,
For
para
the
nós
both of
dois,
us,
esse
this
fake
fake
sucesso
white
branco, no
success
dia a dia
was
tornava-se um
becoming a
peso.
weight.
Ele
Unfortunately,
teria
it
que
was too
suportar
heavy
o
for
peso para
him.
ele.
But it could have been
Poderia
any
ter
of
sido para
us,
qualquer um de
indigenous
nós.
artists.
A cobrança de respostas
The
para
demand for
salvar a arte
answers to save the
precisa
art,
ser
the pressure not
controlada
to
pela
fail in our journey
autoridade para
or with our
inserir
indigenous
e
relatives,
muitas
the
vezes passar
uninterrupted hunger of
a
those who see us
conhecer
as a
novidades
devourable
sobre a
novelty
arte
in the market.
contemporânea,
Everything that is
tudo isso é
considerable
considerado
success
sucesso
And at the peak of his career, there was a wall that surrounded us and that takes us away from what is most important, a healthy life. When we felt the hands of the Western world pulling us away, I pulled back to slow down and think about what was going on. A few weeks ago, I deleted once again my social media accounts to get out of this pressure of always being available and being forced to answer questions such as how to decolonize the world, as if it were our responsibility to save the world ourselves, as if this wasn't everyone's responsibility. Oh no, we are obliged to save a world that never wanted us, but when they need us, they turn to us and demand us to be available. I was with Jider last week. We didn't talk much because our email inboxes were full, our mailbox was full, our schedule was full. We were spending every day together from breakfast to bedtime. But for a whole week, we didn't talk much. We were tired. What is posted on social media does not represent how much pain we're going through daily. I myself, and certainly Jider, do not do this to please white people or to become famous. We wanted to build a path for other indigenous peoples, to build possibilities for our own. We were the mirror for those who are indigenous peoples who still dream of being an artist or being something different from the horrific reality that indigenous children and young people live today. We forced ourselves to be available for a world that, as a Baniwa, I believe, for those who are yet to be born, but that weighs heavily. So I ask with great respect to Jider and to the past, present, future indigenous artists that we take care that this path opened by us is never interdicted. Never let the bush close up. May we, you and I, always clear the way, and may the near future be easier to walk on. Let us take care of the memory of Jider as well. Let's make this path lighter for us and for other people. I understand that if his success and if this summit is the result of our hard work, I feel I need to think about what kind of indigenous art I have to build, and if the reception that the Western art world has given us has brought one of these problems, I need to rethink what kind of relationship I want to maintain with Western art. If it is for art that we will resist, it will be for art. But for me, it won't be to please the hunger of any glutton of art. With affection and admiration, the Nilson Baniwa. Thank you.